Now, there's this growing notion with the trial of George Floyd, or the trial of Derek Chauvin with the death of George Floyd, that in America, if you are the victim of police brutality, and particularly if you've been murdered by the cops, that there is no justice, right? And I think that is very true. I think it's pretty accurate to say that police are rarely held accountable. And there is definitely that notion. And in fact, the stats are 1.7% of the police killings result in charges, and less than 1%, it's actually only 0.25%, actually result in convictions. So it is true that in this country, rarely will a police officer be held accountable for the death of a civilian. However, there's another notion that goes around, and that this is particularly true if you are Black. And I want to break that down. But first, I want to show you this. This is a clip from today. This is Juan Williams on Fox News, The Five. And he kind of shares that sentiment. And I think this is a sentiment that we hear often. So here's the clip.
I have to say that if Derek Chauvin is not prosecuted here and found guilty, then a policeman can basically do anything to an American citizen, especially to a Black man, without any repercussions, because it is such an egregious act.
Okay, so we see him saying that if Derek Chauvin is not convicted, then it shows that police can do anything they want, especially to a Black man. And that is the notion I think we hear over and over. And I think this is a lot of part of the anger and a part of what's causing a lot of the uprising and why many of us are worried about what's potentially going to happen in the coming weeks after the verdict comes back for the Derek Chauvin case. So it is true that, like I mentioned, police are rarely held accountable. So take that aside for a moment, because that is a bigger issue, right? The fact that only 1.7% of cops are ever even charged with the crime is a problem in and of itself. I think we can all agree on that probably cops should be held way more accountable than they are. That is, regardless of which race or color or gender you are, cops are just not really being held accountable. But if we zoom in on that 1.7%, what do we see? Because if the claim is that it's especially true if you're a Black person, if you're a Black man or a Black person in general, Black woman, Black man, that you would be less likely to receive any sort of justice, then we should see disproportionately low numbers of cops charged when the victim is Black in that 1.7%. You following me? Okay. So let's go and break down these numbers, because I was curious about this and I wanted to know, who are these cops that get charged? How often are cops charged? And what is the race of the victim when the cop is charged? It's interesting information. So first and foremost, we know that the Black population in America is 13.5%, okay? And here is the stat on the rate of fatal police shootings in the United States. And this is from 2015 to March of 2021 by ethnicity. And you can see right here that Blacks account for 35% of the fatal police shootings in the United States, yet they're only 13.5% of the population. So we know this stat, right? We know, we've heard it over and over, that Blacks are disproportionately targeted when it comes to fatal police shootings. Now, I don't want to get into the why in this segment. Many people will say it's because of racism. Others will say no, because it's interaction with police. Higher crime rates would lead to more interaction with police, which would then lead to more negative outcomes with police. Okay, so there's a variety of thought as to why there's a disproportionate percentage of Blacks killed by cops than there are Black people in America, 13.5%. But let's look at this. So we know that there's 35% of the fatal shootings are Black victims. And that would mean, if we were to be fair, in that 1.7%, when we're zooming in on a microscope, right, that at least 35% of those charged cops would have Black victims, right? We should see a direct percentage if things are fair. So if Black victims get the same amount of justice as any other victim, we should see at least 35% of the cops charged having Black victims, okay? So finding this number was a little tricky, but was able to figure this out. Now, let me go ahead and show you. Let me find, here it is. This is the Bowling Green State University has this great group, this research group, the Police Integrity Research Group. And they put together all of the stats for the fatal police killings that resulted in charges, not necessarily convictions, but charged at least. A cop is being held somewhat accountable between the years of 2005 and 2019. Specifically June 24th of 2019. So halfway through June, halfway through the year. So almost 15 years they looked at, and they wanted to study it and see how often are cops charged and who are the victims when the cop is charged, and how often are cops convicted and who are the victims when cops are convicted. So this is interesting information, and I thought you should know about it. So they found during those 15 years that there were 104 non-federal sworn law enforcement officers with the general powers of arrest. So that would be police officers, deputy sheriffs, state troopers who have been arrested for murder or manslaughter or anything in between, resulting from an on-duty shooting where the officer shot and killed someone at incidents throughout the United States. 104. So 15 years, 104 charges is extremely low. That's where that 1.7% comes from. On average, we have about 900 to 1,000 killings per year. Many are armed, many are unarmed, whatever, but it's still about 900 to 1,000 per year. So you take that 15 years worth and you only get 104 officers that are actually charged with the death of an American civilian or a civilian at all of any nationality. And you get that really, really low stat of 1.7. So the chance that a police officer of any kind is going to be held accountable is extremely low, no matter what your race is. Okay, let's get that out of the way. It is very, very low. If you or I get killed by a cop, it is not likely that cop is going to be charged with crime. They get away with murder, literally. So of those 104 to date from this writing, only 35 had been convicted of a crime resulting from the on-duty shooting. So only 35 had been convicted of the 104. So even if the cop is charged, which is already extremely slim, the chances of that cop actually being convicted, even slimmer. That's where that 0.25 comes in, okay? 15 by guilty plea, 20 by jury trial, and none convicted by a bench trial. So this is interesting. Now let's look at the race of the officers and the victims, because again, if the idea is true that Juan Williams from Fox News said, and many others are saying, that there's no justice in America when there's police brutality, especially if you're black, meaning when we see 35% of black victims, we should see at least 35% of the cops charged having black victims. But especially if you're black, there's no justice, we would see lower than that, okay? So let's look at the numbers. The numbers show that of non-black officers, this is the data for completed cases. Now there's 104 cases, 104 charge cases, 80 of which have completed. The rest are still in motion. Cases can drag on for years. So from the time of this report. So 80 of these resulted in 29 convicted non-black officers and 38 not convicted non-black officers, 6 convicted black officers, 7 not convicted non-black officers. Just so you know, the rate of which you would be convicted versus not convicted so far, if you're not black, that rate is about 55, 56% that you're going to not be charged, that you're going to get away with it. And if you're black, it's about 53, 54%. So it's about the same whether you're, and that's within the margin of error. So black or not black, your chances of getting away with it are about 55%, okay? The other half the time, they're actually charged with the crime. So that's interesting, or they're at least convicted. So very few are charged, but if you're charged, it's about 55% chance you're going to get away with it and 45% chance that you're going to actually be convicted. Not very good odds, really. Now, of the 29 convicted non-black officers, in the cases, the victims were 19 were black and 10 were not black. 65% of the victims of the convicted officers that were not black were black victims. 65%. That is not only meeting that 35% criteria, it is well exceeding it. So that stat right there actually shows that no, it is not true that you don't have justice in America, especially if you're black, in regard to police killings. Actually, you have way more, you have a higher chance of having justice than the rest of us if you're black in this country. That is a 65% chance that if you're black, your perpetrator will be convicted. That is way higher than the rest. 38 of the non-convicted Now let's look at the charge, right? So this is somebody who wasn't convicted, but they were at least charged with the crime. 38 of the non-convicted officers who were not black, so white, Hispanic, Asian officers, victims in those cases, 21 were black, 17 were not black. So again, that's about a 50-50 chance. When the cop gets away with it, it's about 50-50 that the perpetrator was black or not black. So actually, if you're a non-black officer, your chance of getting away with murder if your victim is black is a lot lower than if your victim is white, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American. So those are the actual numbers. Now, if you're a black officer, again, 6 convicted black officers, the victims in the cases, 3 were black, 3 were not black. So it's 50-50 if the officer is black. It's a 50-50 chance right there when the person is convicted. About 50-50 that you're convicted or not convicted. It's 55% not convicted, 45% that are convicted. And in those cases of convicted, half the victims were black, half the victims were not. In those that were not convicted, 7 victims were also all black. So looking at these numbers, when you look at the number of victims, so note that there have been 35 officers convicted in one of these cases. And the victims in 22 of those 35 cases were black. So you have actually more black victims than you have non-black victims when police are charged with the murder or manslaughter in the case of shooting people and killing them. I thought this stat was really, really interesting because I think, look, if you're going to take to the streets and you're going to burn things down and you're going to, go loot and riot and do all of these things out of anger and you're protesting, you're mad, you're wanting change, you should at least have accurate data. So if you're doing it because you believe that cops get away with murder, especially they get away with black murder, then you should have the stats to back that up. And unfortunately, the stats don't actually back that up. The stats show that if you're a black victim, you actually have a higher chance of getting justice than anybody else. The chances are actually in your favor. So why is that? Well, I think what this shows, if there's going to be a positive note to this, is it shows that public outcry works. When people get mad, I'm not saying go take to the streets and burn things down and loot buildings, but what we've seen in majority of these cases is protesting. People took and they protested. They took to the streets. They expressed their anger. Most of them did not result in violence. You have to remember that was something kind of unique to summer of 2020 and George Floyd. And there have been some incidences of that. But most of the time when it's a black teenager shot or a black young man killed, people take to the streets. They're angry. They put public pressure on the DA. They put public pressure on the city. The news outlets, they cover the story. It becomes national news. And then there's a lot of pressure to put charges against the officer. So this shows us that public outcry works. It shows us that there's disproportionate public outcry for black victims over any other race. And it shows that it works. I mean, at the end of the day, the squeaky wheels get the grease. And so in this case, cops that kill black people actually have a higher rate of being charged than any other race. And I thought that was extremely interesting. So before you take to the streets and you're mad, at least have this stat correct. If you want to take to the streets for something else, if you want to be, protest something, there's many things that you can protest for sure. This in particular just can't be one of them. You cannot make the claim that Juan Williams on Fox News made, which is, there is no accountability for police, especially if you're black. That's actually not the case. And we have the data now to prove that. So interesting. Again, if you have any thoughts, questions, you can always email me, kim@kimiverson.com. But you can also join my locals page and put your comments there. You can go to my locals. It is down in the link down below. Check it out. Join the community. It's a lot of fun. You can interact not only with me, but you can interact with one another. And you can also post your own information, videos, links, articles, pictures, all of that stuff. It's kind of a fun social media site mixed with where you're going to get exclusive content, also mixed with you receiving just my random thoughts. I'm not on Twitter or things like that, but I am on locals, and that's where I kind of share my thoughts on things that are going on. So be sure to join that. The link is down below.